The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on... coming to you from Baton Rouge Community Radio here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Oh, what a week it's been. We're glad to have you here. This is live call-in show, by the way. We're going to discuss the origins of the Middle Eastern countries as they are today for tonight, and I'm going to do my best to hold up my end. Lang Baker's with me tonight. Hello, Lang.
Hi, Wayne.
And feel free to call in if you'd like to ask questions or make comments. 343-9927, 343-9927. And as I said, we'll be talking tonight about how the current countries in the Middle East came about, because they didn't all exist in their current form until World War I, actually, just after World War I, Lang, is how I saw it. But and my reason for wanting to do a show like this is because a lot of the hatred and distrust of Britain, France, and the U.S., and particularly the U.S. now, because we ended up being the top dog in the region, is rooted in Western involvement in those countries from, right around from World War I, Lang. I think you learned that too in your studies. But I'm looking at a map here from 1914, which was the beginning of World War I. And it shows countries all around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, directly north on the northern coast was Greece, and then heading eastward was the Ottoman Empire, which extended eastward all the way to Persia and just around the northeastern coast of the Mediterranean. And then just down below that on the eastern coast was Greater Syria, or an area labeled Syria, Lang. And then below...
Part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, this is all the Ottoman Empire I'm talking about here. Ottoman Empire was modern-day Turkey, now Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, and then a large region called Syria, and then Palestine on the southeast coast of the Mediterranean. And Lang, you were saying west on the southwest coast of the Mediterranean was the Sultanate of Egypt, and it says here in the map here was a British protectorate at that time, right?
Right. What I read about showed how the Suez Canal was built around 1859 to 69, something like that, and through from there forward, the British gained greater and greater dominance of the area. The Suez Canal, as I understood it, was built so the British would have a shorter route to their colonies, the parts of the empire over India and other points in that part of Asia.
Okay, and I wanted to point out there at the time that this map was made, there was no Iraq, so to speak. It was Mesopotamia.
There was not a nation of Iraq.
Not a nation of Iraq, right.
Or Jordan or Lebanon or...
Certainly not Israel. That didn't come around for a lot longer than that. And also Libya did not exist yet. That was Algiers, I believe. Algeria, I believe. And that was disputed by the Ottomans. The Barbary Coast.
Algeria is on over further east from Libya. Libya is a country between Egypt and Algeria. Algeria was French, under French control up until I think it was in the 1950s or so. They were in the Civil War.
Well, I saw so many.
Algerians.
Yeah, I saw so many maps, and as Lang and I were getting ready for the show, I was discovering just how confused I was. So hopefully Lang can keep me straight. In any case, the Ottoman Empire was a reluctant, I guess, participant on the German side of World War I. That's what got all of them involved in this. Well, actually, Britain and Russia were heavily involved all over Persia and that part of the world for various reasons, economic on the part of the British, and for Russia, they were wanting to find as they've always been wanting to find an access to a warm water port, because their main port in the Sea of Okhotsk is frozen for a good part of the year.
Yeah, we're talking about Tsarist Russia now. This is
Yes, not the Soviet Union.
Russian
This
Revolution.
is right. This is Russia, just pure Russia. Yeah.
Tsarist.
And then, and they were mainly Britain had been a rival of Russia, but as Germany's power was rising all over the world, but also especially in Europe, they decided to become allies with Russia and participate in exploiting the Middle East, all these regions we just talked about here, to defend themselves against the Germans and the Ottoman Empire, which ended up joining World War I with Germany.
Yeah, one source I came across was saying that the Ottomans were put out feelers to see if they could sign up with the British side, but they were spurned by the British, according to this source, and so that's when they ended up aligning themselves with Germany and Austro-Hungary, which became those three central powers against the Entente, or the Allies,
Right.
the French, British, and Russians.
Right, and of course, once Germany stood down, so to speak, they hadn't surrendered, as I understand it, by 1918. They had just backed off and were reconsidering, but the Allies were already, forming their treaties and all that. But it was at the end of World War I, whenever the official point was, that France, Britain, and what was the other one? No, I guess it was just France and Britain divided up the countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, by then Russia was out of it because they had had their revolution, and they, in fact, one of the secret deals in splitting up that region of the world was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which originally was a three-way agreement with Russia in there as well, and Russia was going to get access to the Mediterranean by taking over that part of what had been the Ottoman Empire. But their secret deal was published by the revolutionaries,
Bolsheviks, yeah.
when they dumped the Tsar's archives kind of into WikiLeaks of the day or whatever, and that kind of surprised some people who didn't know that the British were double dealing.
Okay, so now the British already had a strong influence in Egypt on the southeast part of the Mediterranean, and once the Ottoman Empire fell, I think they established the nation of Turkey, for one thing.
Well, Turkey
or was it
is
already a region?
Well, that was the heart of the Ottoman Empire, but there were revolutionaries in Turkey that fought and gained their nation, the Republic of Turkey.
Okay.
In the years right after the end of the war, as I recall.
Okay. Now, I did want to point out, too, that the area of Persian, which was east of Mesopotamia, was what eventually became Iran. And they actually, from what I was able to find, had already established, they had a constitutional revolution where they established a parliamentary government right around 1905, 1909.
Before the First World War started.
Yes, before the First World War. But nevertheless, the British and Russia had been in that country, that part of the world, for a long time anyway. Again, either competing with each other or then cooperating.
Yeah, and one lecture I listened to said there were a lot of war casualties in Persia, Iran, from just being collateral damage of the fighting between the Russians and the Ottomans and the Brits.
Yeah, well,
They weren't involved in the war as combatants, but there were a lot of deaths there from being victims of the warring parties.
Well, and that's interesting because that's kind of how the whole history of the Middle East has been since the Western powers divvied them up and made these artificial boundaries. I mean, a lot of the policy of the United States, I mean, look at Iraq, how many people died there, and that was directly related to all this, going all the way back to World War I. That was all part of it. And I could trace that back. That's something I did stay up on once we invaded Iraq. I got into that to find out why. But anyway, okay, and the other area, though, was east of Palestine and south was the huge Arabian desert. That was largely nothing, really. It was just Arab or Arabia.
Well, Bedouin tribes.
Bedouin tribes,
nomadic peoples.
Yes, and in fact, that's what it says on this map here, 1914 map, is Bedouin tribes all over here, so. But okay, so the British and the French and the Russians come out on top in World War I, and they're getting ready to divide up the area. But as you said, Lang, the Russians had to back out because they got overthrown by the Bolsheviks, and they blew the whistle on the deal. Now, the Sykes-Picot deal was mainly to divide up Iraq or Mesopotamia, right?
Well, it was, from what I read, it was to divide up the Levant, south of Turkey and in north of Egypt, and mainly along, the Mediterranean coast and inland from there, to provide. Well, they had their own interest. I don't know exactly what the French interest was, whether it basically boiled down to the spoils of war kind of attitude of the previous century carried over into the 20th century.
Oil was mentioned in...
I read where the Brits were interested in the oil of Iraq.
Very much so. In Paris, 1919, by Margaret Macmillan. This is an award-winning history of the negotiations between the European powers and others after World War I. And oil figured prominently in here. The British especially said that we need to take that. We need to keep anybody else from getting it, and we need it for ourselves because we won a victory in World War I with oil by having access to oil at the time, and that was largely why they took over much of what became Iraq. I think I just read before the show that they had already decided on taking the lower two provinces, which were the Sunni. They were Sunni and Shiite dominated, but then more oil was found toward the north, so they decided to lump in the northern part of Mesopotamia too, and that was what became Iraq.
It was like the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites.
Yeah, like it is now. Basically, you have the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites, and of course that was one of the reasons why there began being such strife between the religious organizations, because those were unnatural boundaries for them. They didn't have a unified government at the time, and so now they're suddenly expected to be citizens together, and naturally one side is going to try to dominate, the rest, and there we go, So anyway, so oil was one of the main reasons why the British were interested in that part of the world. And as I said, they were also involved with Persia, which declared with its own constitutional revolution, like I said, declared a democracy and had a parliament and everything else. And they actually managed to barely function from about 1905, 1909, something around there, all the way up until 1953. And this is where I'm on surer footing here, but during that whole time, Russia and Britain were still involved in Iran drilling for oil and pumping it out. And of course, Russia during that time became the Soviet Union, which was an arch enemy of America, and all free people. But they kept stirring up trouble among the different religious tribes in the region to keep the Iranian government from ever gaining full control over their oil. They were deliberately stirring up trouble to keep the government from taxing them properly and getting their just take on the oil. And so eventually the Iranian government, and I'm sure America made the offer first, I believe, but America volunteered to come in and take care of those problems for them for a share of the oil. And the first thing that the U.S. did was get the Soviets kicked out, and then the U.S. and Britain continued on the same way Russia and the Soviet Union and Britain had done before, stirring up trouble and all that, keeping the Iranian government off balance. So in 1953, the Iranian government voted to nationalize the oil fields. Is that right? No, 1951, they voted to nationalize the oil fields, and Britain and America immediately set about orchestrating a coup, and they paid off General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. was the bag man, actually. I remember reading this. They conspired with a bunch of generals who had wanted to get back into power after the Shah had taken over, and the Shah was overthrown. They were pro-Shah, and the Shah was overthrown to establish a parliamentary government, and so we paid them. They overthrew the democratic government of Iran and installed the Shah again, and so they've been fighting all their history against religious rule and the tyrants of local imams or whatever. But and they finally achieved the democratic government, and then we, the democratic countries in the world, overthrew it, and they ended up stuck with a theological theocracy again. Here I am confusing myself. We overthrew the Shah, or the democratic government put the Shah in power, and then the Iranian Revolution of '79 overthrew the Shah and kicked us and Britain out. But anyway, that's my
And that's when the theocracy.
that was when the theocracy
came
started.
in.
Anyhow, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. One of us is struggling to describe the events in the Middle East and how these countries were created. I think so far and the other, Lang, is holding up his hand. But you feel free to call in and ridicule me or help me out. 343-9927, 343-9927. Call in and share your 2 cents worth. Okay, Lang, we've covered Iran, and I think Iraq too. We got that taken care of, right?
Yeah, and in large part, yeah. So to get moving westward from Iran, we've got the countries that form the eastern coast of the Mediterranean there, which now you've got Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and then back inland is Jordan, and then beyond that.
Right, but originally that was just
is.
Palestine.
But
and
this was
Greater
part
Syria,
of these were provinces within the Ottoman Empire back at the time of the beginning of the First World War. And so I referred to the British double dealing before, talking about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but that was one of 3 different agreements or offerings by the British in their various negotiations with separate parties, and that was one between the Brits and France and originally Russia. But then another deal they had was with the Arabs to have an Arab uprising against the Ottomans, and that's been portrayed in Lawrence of Arabia, the movie, where you've got the British T.E. Lawrence fighting with the Arabs to disrupt the Ottomans in that part of their empire.
And I think that was Emir Hussein from Arabia.
There you go, yeah. And from one place I read, he had actually gone up to the head of the Ottoman Empire seeking to get his agreement to grant him more autonomy in the Arab area, and was rejected. And so then, according to some sources, he went to the British to ask for them, and the other sources say the British went to him. But both sides agree that there was this agreement made where the Arabs would be given their free Arabian state after the war, and that was in conflict with the Sykes-Picot. And then the third part of double dealing or triple dealing was the Balfour Declaration by the British cabinet, I guess, is what officially it would be called. I'm not that up on British government structure, but the authority within Britain with the Queen's or the King's approval to grant the Zionists the right to settle in that area. And the Zionist movement was in Eastern Europe wanting to establish a homeland for the Jews back in their ancestral home area, which conflicted with giving an Arab state there and conflicted with the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Right. Yeah, now, the way I understand it, and we talked about this before going on the air, Palestine up until this point, even after the Balfour Agreement, I think, was a region of all 3 major religions, basically Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, and they lived just fine on their own. But the Balfour Declaration provided the permission, so to speak, I guess, for Jews to settle there, but nothing was really done at first, was it?
Well, they began coming in larger numbers. It was traditionally under the Ottoman Empire, from one or more of the sources that I was reading and listening to through lectures, there was about 5% of the population in that area was Jewish at at that time, before there was any movement of East European Jews in. These were
just had been there since
for time
ever,
immemorial. Yeah.
Right, and they got along fine. Was the main point I wanted to make. And
right.
And yeah, the actual Israeli state wasn't formed until 1948.
Yeah, after the Second World War.
After the Second World War, yes. And as I understand it here, the United States supported the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and but Franklin Roosevelt had assured the Arabs, there's another double dealing here, had assured the Arabs in 1945 that the United States would not intervene without consulting both the Jews and the Arabs in that region, and then we went ahead and went along with it anyway. Well, Roosevelt died, and Truman went ahead and approved it. Great Britain also wanted to preserve good relations with the Arabs, so they didn't want to give it up either at that time. But as I recall, I remember reading a book, I think it was about David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel when it was created. There were terrorist actions committed by the Jews there against British institutions because the British were dragging their feet, not wanting to establish the British state, or the Jewish state. And Menachem Begin, I remember seeing a picture of a wanted poster of him for blowing up, I think it might have been setting off a bomb in front of the British embassy or whatever. It was some big deal, and they were out to get him, but he ended up being a prime minister of Israel later on. And I was alive when he was there. Anyway, but so that was the formation of Israel, and I remember reading some time back that Muslims don't hate Jews in particular, as many Americans have been led to believe. They hate the Jews that settled in Palestine because they were displaced from their homes. They and Christians, the other people that were there, they were displaced from their homes by outside powers, and they established this state on some of the best real estate in Palestine and left them to suffer in the desert. And that's the source of their discontent today, I believe.
Yeah, I think from what I've heard, it's opposition to the Zionist movement as a colonizing movement.
Yes, it was, and there were a lot of Jews who were opposed to the Zionist movement as well.
Right.
I mean, because they could see that it was wrong to throw these people off of their land like that.
Yeah, and from one of the reports I heard during the debate over whether to issue the Balfour Declaration, there was one Jewish member of the cabinet who was the strongest one opposed to issuing that agreement because he was saying that will create great conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in the region.
Was Lord George Curzon, I believe. He was the one. I wouldn't remember the name. I think, I just happened to read that in Margaret Macmillan's book. But yeah, he was saying how they were going to create all kinds of hate and discontent in that part of the world if we went through with all this, and nevertheless they did, and sure enough we have,
Mm-hmm. And the Balfour Declaration itself included language that there was to be no harm, or I forget the exact words that were used, but it was that the Zionists who were coming there were to respect the rights of the people who were already there, the inhabitants of the land.
Yes, and I recall that was another source of anger and hatred in the rest of Palestine because they quickly threw that off. They never paid any attention to that mandate. They took what they wanted to, and let's face it, they wanted the people that settled in Israel wanted to ensure they survived. They were zealous in that, and I can understand that. But anyhow, okay, we covered Israel now.
So the result from following through on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was the drawing up of the map of how the victorious powers, France and Britain, were going to split up the spoils of war. The French got the northern part and the Brits got the southern part, and that was under the newly created League of Nations. Those two nations were given the mandate to oversee these territories until, according to the terms of the League of Nations document, until they were able to stand on their own. And so what the area that the French got is what today would be Syria and Lebanon, but originally was divided up into 4 different areas. North of what's now Lebanon was I forget the tribe there. They were Shias, and they were the the tribe that the family of the Assads came from, and subsequently, when the French pulled out, they kept Lebanon a separate nation, but they combined the other three territories in this minority tribal group that was on the coast north of Lebanon, and was the home group, the ethnic group that the Assad family came from. They're the ones that dominate Syria in the decades since then.
Okay.
And they're represented by the majority Sunnis of Syria, and that's the source of a lot of the conflict within the nation that led to the civil war with the Arab Spring uprising.
Because the government was run by
an oppressive government,
a religious sect that was a relative minority,
and oppressive in
they
their
were
treatment of
yes.
the population.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was, and one commentator that I heard in his lecture was saying that this tribe was basically like a warrior tribe in the mountains that would come and conduct raids against the settled Sunnis of the larger area. So it went back to a tribal rivalry even before the state of Syria was created,
and
according to this lecturer.
And the Western powers then put those marauders in charge of a government.
Well, I'm not sure just whether it was through their own dominant warrior-like powers, or whether they were installed officially by the French. But when the French pulled out, these other three areas were combined to create the nation of Syria, or the borders of Syria now.
Okay.
And then the British part, is what was Transjordan or Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, and what is now Israel, or was Palestine.
Right.
And going back to the other deal of the promise to the Arabs, it was like you mentioned the head of the family who had got
Emir Hussein.
Yeah,
yes,
well, he had these three sons, and so the original idea to fulfill that before the mandate came into place was to parcel out Jordan, Iraq, and Syria to these three sons. And the son who got Jordan, that's the family that still rules Jordan. It's the Kingdom of Jordan. But the son who was given Syria, he installed himself as the king of Syria, and then when the French came in, they kicked him out, ran him out of town. So he lost his kingdom, and the French got it. And then the one who was installed in Iraq, you mentioned an uprising in Iraq that overthrew him.
Yeah. Did you look into Saudi Arabia at all and how that was formed?
I did look into that a little bit, and that was not within the Ottoman Empire.
No. Right.
And it was over a larger period of time than the First World War that the family of Saud,
the House of Saud,
the House of Saud, came to consolidate power there. And they were...
there was no Western influence in that, though? I was under the impression there had been.
I don't know about that. I know later there was with the oil, at the time of the oil, but at the time of the creation of it, I'm not sure. There must have been here, from what I'm looking over some of my notes here. It was the unification of Saudi Arabia was a military and political campaign lasting from 1902 to 1932, so it was over a 30-year period that began before the First World War and didn't end until long after the end of the First World War, to consolidate modern-day Saudi Arabia. But Al Saud was in exile in the British-protected Emirate of Kuwait from 1893 until he returned in 1902. So the Brits played some role there, apparently, but I don't know to how active their role was in that. From what I read.
Well, we didn't get time to get into the more recent histories, and oh well. But it's an elaborate history for sure in the Middle East, very complicated.
Yes.
Once we got in there, once the Western countries got in there, drawing arbitrary boundaries and all that. I mean,
yeah, it's fascinating. I never got into this till you brought the topic up for this week, but it's just fascinating stuff. And there's some really good lectures by experts in the field.
I
on
think maybe we'll
YouTube.
do another show on just Iraq and Iran. That way I can get my facts straight, and I can talk a little more about Saddam Hussein and how intimately he was involved in the recent histories of both Iran and Iraq, really. It's all linked together, along with Kuwait and all that. But anyway, we've got to go. This is Wayne Parker with a pause for thought, coming to you from Baton Rouge Community Radio here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You've been listening to me and mostly Lang Baker talk about the origins of the modern Middle East, or current-day Middle Eastern countries, and hopefully we gave some kind of understanding for why that region is so unstable today. We've got to go. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.